Imagine being the richest and most powerful ruler on earth. You command an empire so vast that the sun quite literally never sets on it. Ships arrive at your ports groaning with silver, more treasure than any monarch in history has ever laid eyes on. And now imagine going bankrupt anyway, not once, not twice, again, and again, and again, more times than any nation before or since. That was the strange, almost unbelievable position of Habsburg Spain in the 16th and 17th centuries. It sat on top of a river of silver flowing out of the mountains of the Americas, and it still could not pay its bills because it owed everything to a small circle of bankers in Genoa and Augsburg who had figured out something the kings never fully grasped. The silver arrived once a year. The wars needed money every single day. And into that gap, the bankers stepped and offered to lend the crown money against silver that hadn't even crossed the ocean yet. At ruinous interest. With the treasure pledged before it was ever dug out of the ground. And here is the part that should make the hair on your neck stand up. When the crown couldn't pay, and it very often couldn't, the bankers didn't lose. They kept the collateral, and the collateral wasn't just money, it was the mines, it was the mercury, it was the tax revenues of entire provinces. It was, in one astonishing case, a piece of the New World itself. The kings of Spain believed they owned an empire built on silver. In truth, they had quietly signed most of it over to the men who lent them their own silver back. Let me show you how that happened. To understand the trap, you first have to understand the treasure, because the treasure was real and it was staggering. In 1545, deep in the mountains of what is now Bolivia, the Spanish found something that would reshape the entire world economy. A mountain, but not an ordinary mountain. This one was veined through with silver, so much silver that they called it the Cerro Rico, the rich hill. The town that sprang up at its foot was Potosi, and within a few decades it became one of the largest and wealthiest cities on the planet, sitting at a brutal altitude of over 4,000 meters, in a place where nothing should have grown a city at all, existing for one reason only: to tear silver out of the ground. And it wasn't alone. In Mexico, the mines of Zacatecas and Guanajuato were pouring out their own fortunes in silver at almost the same time. Suddenly, Spain had access to a supply of precious metal unlike anything the world had ever seen. Now, getting the silver out of the raw ore required one crucial ingredient, and I want you to remember this because it becomes important. To refine the silver, they used a process that depended on mercury. You mixed mercury with the crushed ore, and it bonded with the silver and let you separate it out. No mercury, no efficient silver. And the greatest mercury deposits in Europe happened to sit in a place called Almaden, in Spain itself. So the whole machine of American silver depended on that one Spanish mercury supply. Hold that thought. The scale of what came out was almost hard to believe. Over the century and a half that followed, an estimated 16,000 tons of silver were officially registered as arriving in Spain, and historians think a great deal more was smuggled in, unregistered on top of that. It came across the Atlantic in great convoys, the treasure fleets, heavily guarded ships that sailed, for the most part, just once or twice a year, and unloaded their cargo at the port of Seville, where a royal agency called the House of Trade counted it, taxed it, and took the crown's share, the famous royal fifth. On paper, this made the King of Spain the wealthiest man who had ever lived. But before we go further, it's worth pausing on where this treasure actually came from, because the silver was soaked in suffering. Potosi grew, at its peak, into one of the largest cities in the entire world, its population rivaling London or Paris, an improbable metropolis of well over 100,000 people clinging to a freezing mountainside, all of it feeding on the silver inside the rock. And that silver was extracted through brutal systems of forced labor imposed on the indigenous people of the Americas. In the Andes, the Spanish revived and twisted an old Incan labor draft called the mita, conscripting native men from across a huge region and sending them, in rotation, down into the mountain. They went into the dark for weeks at a time, hauling ore up rickety ladders in thin air, and they died in enormous numbers, from cave-ins, from exhaustion, from the cold, from the sheer murderous conditions. The mountain earned a grim nickname. They called it the mountain that eats men, and the mercury, the very substance that made the refining possible, is a poison. The workers who handled it in the refineries sickened and died of mercury poisoning, their bodies destroyed by the metal that turned ore into treasure. Potosi produced staggering wealth, and it produced staggering death, and the two were the same thing. So when we talk about Spain's river of silver, understand that it was from the very first a river of human cost. This was the treasure. Now here is the trap. The problem was timing. Beautiful, deadly timing. Because that silver came in once a year, in a giant lump, on a fleet that might be late, might be scattered by a storm, might be sunk, or might, on a very bad day, be captured by English or Dutch raiders. It was a single, unreliable, annual windfall. But Spain's expenses were not annual, they were constant, and they were enormous, because Habsburg Spain was essentially always at war. Always. It fought the French for dominance in Italy. It fought the Ottoman Empire across the Mediterranean. It fought a grinding, decades-long war to hold down a rebellion in the Netherlands. It fought England. It fought the Protestant princes of Germany. War was not an occasional emergency for Spain. War was the permanent condition of its existence, and war is the most cash-hungry activity human beings have ever invented. And the numbers were crushing. The Army of Flanders, the force Spain kept in the Netherlands to hold down the Dutch revolt, grew into the largest standing army in Europe. Tens of thousands of professional soldiers who all had to be fed, armed, and above all paid, month after month, year after year, for 80 years, and that was just one front. In 1588, Spain assembled the Great Armada, a vast fleet of around 130 ships meant to invade England, at a cost so enormous it staggered even the crown's own treasurers, and then watched most of it wrecked by storms and English guns, the money vanishing to the bottom of the sea in a matter of weeks. Every one of these efforts devoured mountains of silver, and none of them could wait for the treasure fleet to arrive on its own schedule. The bills came due constantly, everywhere, all at once. And here is the crucial mismatch. An army in Flanders needs to be paid this month, or it mutinies and falls apart. A fleet in the Mediterranean needs supplies now. The soldiers holding a fortress in Italy need their wages in the spring, not in the autumn, when the treasure fleet finally limps into Seville. The money had to be in a specific place, at a specific time, in a specific currency, often thousands of miles from where the silver actually landed. Getting cash from a dock in Seville into the hands of a soldier in Antwerp was itself a massive logistical challenge, one the Spanish crown had no good way to solve on its own. So the King of Spain, the richest ruler on earth, was permanently, chronically, desperately short of money in the right place at the right time, and there was only one way to fix that: borrow now against the silver that would arrive later. And to borrow, you need lenders, which brings us, at last, to the bankers. To meet the founding father of this whole system, we have to go back a little earlier, to a man in the German city of Augsburg named Jakob Fugger. He is sometimes called Jakob the Rich, and by many estimates, he was, in relative terms, one of the wealthiest human beings who has ever lived. The Fugger family had built a fortune in textiles and then in mining, and Jakob had turned that fortune into something new, a banking operation that lent staggering sums to the crowned heads of Europe. And his greatest client was the Habsburg dynasty. The relationship reached its climax in 1519, in one of the most extraordinary transactions in the history of money and power. For years, Fugger had been the paymaster of the previous Habsburg emperor, Maximilian, a restless, war-hungry ruler who was chronically broke and who, by the time he died, owed Fugger a fortune. And that created a problem for the banker. If the Habsburgs lost their grip on power, all that debt might never be repaid. Fugger's money was, in a sense, trapped inside the dynasty, and the only way to protect it was to make sure the Habsburgs kept the throne. So when the imperial crown came open, Fugger had every reason to make sure it stayed in the family. The position of Holy Roman Emperor had come open, and it was an elected office. 7 German princes, the electors, would choose the next emperor, but this was not a noble contest of ideals. It was, for all practical purposes, an auction. The electors expected to be paid lavishly for their votes, and 2 men were bidding for the crown: Charles of Spain, the young Habsburg heir, and Francis I, the King of France. The bidding war spiraled to an astronomical sum, something on the order of 850,000 florins in bribes to buy the votes. Charles did not have that kind of cash lying around. Almost nobody did, but Jacob Fugger did. Fugger stepped in and put up the lion's share of the money himself, roughly 2/3 of the entire bribe fund, and organized the rest from other bankers. And he did it with a clever, cold-eyed mechanism. The bribe money for each elector was deposited with an agent in that elector's own city, and it would only be released to him once it was confirmed that he had actually cast his vote for Charles. No vote, no payment. And it worked. Charles of Spain became Charles V, Holy Roman Emperor, ruler of an empire that stretched across Europe and now, with the conquests in the Americas, across the world. He became the most powerful man on the planet, and he became emperor because a banker in Augsburg bought him the crown, and Jakob Fugger knew exactly what he had done, and he was not shy about it. A few years later, when the emperor was slow to repay, Fugger wrote him a letter that has become famous, a letter in which a private banker essentially reminded the most powerful monarch in the world that he owed his throne to Fugger's money, that without that money, the imperial crown would have gone to someone else. It was a breathtaking reversal of the natural order. The emperor was supposed to be above everyone, but the banker was reminding him, in writing, who was really holding the leash. This is the template for the entire story. The monarch does not command the banker. The monarch owes the banker, and the only question is how he pays. And here is how Charles paid, because he certainly couldn't pay in cash he didn't have. He paid in pieces of his empire. This is where the title of this story stops being a metaphor and becomes literal fact. To settle his debts, Charles handed the Fuggers control of some of the crown's most valuable assets. And remember that mercury I told you to hold on to, the stuff you needed to refine all that American silver? The Fuggers got Almaden. They took over the great mercury mines, the very choke point of the entire silver economy. Think about the beauty and the horror of that arrangement. The bankers who were lending the crown money against its future silver also controlled the mercury without which that silver could barely be refined in the first place. They had a hand on the treasure at both ends. But it didn't stop with the mercury. The Fuggers also leased the maestrazgos, which were the vast revenues of Spain's 3 great military religious orders of knights, enormous streams of land rent and income that they now collected for themselves. They took silver mines at Guadalcanal. They took monopolies. And another Augsburg banking family, the Welsers, who had helped fund that imperial election, received something even more staggering. To work off Habsburg debts, they were granted the rights to an entire chunk of the New World. They were handed Venezuela. A German banking house was given a piece of the Americas as loan collateral to colonize and exploit for profit. Sit with that for a moment. The empire was so cash poor and so debt rich that it was pawning off its provinces, its mines, and its overseas territories to private bankers, one contract at a time. The kings thought they were ruling an empire. They were increasingly mortgaging it. Now, the instrument that made all of this run, the workhorse contract at the center of Spanish finance, had a name. It was called the asiento. And you need to understand how it worked, because it is genuinely ingenious and genuinely predatory. An asiento was a short-term loan contract between the crown and a banker. The banker would agree to deliver a sum of money, but here's the clever part. He would often deliver it in a completely different place, and in a completely different currency than where he received his repayment. So a banker might agree to hand over gold coins in Antwerp right now, so the army of Flanders could be paid and wouldn't mutiny. And in exchange, the crown would repay him later, in Castile, out of the silver and taxes flowing into Seville. The banker was not just lending money, he was performing a miracle of logistics that the crown could not perform itself. He was turning silver sitting on a dock in Spain into soldiers' wages in the Low Countries, on time, every time. And that service was worth a fortune, so he charged like it. Interest rates on these contracts routinely ran above 15%, and sometimes much higher, and the collateral, the security for these loans, was the silver itself. But not silver the crown actually had. Future silver. Silver that was still in the ground in Peru, or still being loaded onto ships, or still somewhere out on the Atlantic. The treasure fleet was, in effect, mortgaged before it ever sailed. Each year's shipment was already pledged, already spoken for, already owed to the bankers, before a single coin reached Seville. The crown was living permanently on next year's income, and then the year after that, borrowing against silver it hadn't seen, to pay for wars it was already fighting. It's the financial equivalent of spending your entire paycheck before it arrives, every month, forever, while paying 15% for the privilege. After the Fuggers began to fade, a new group of bankers took over the machine, and they were even more sophisticated. They came from Genoa, a small but immensely wealthy Italian republic, and the period of their dominance was so complete that historians call it the century of the Genoese. Families with names like Spinola, Grimaldi, Doria, and Centurion came to run the finances of the entire Spanish Empire, and the way they did it was a masterpiece of early finance. The Genoese raised their money at great international gatherings called the exchange fairs, held first at a place called Besançon and later near Genoa itself, where merchants and bankers from all over Europe came together 4 times a year to settle debts and trade in bills of exchange. Now, a bill of exchange sounds dry, but it was one of the most powerful financial inventions of the age. It was essentially a piece of paper, a promise to pay a certain sum, in a certain city, in a certain currency, at a certain future date. And because these bills could be bought, sold, and discounted, the Genoese could conjure enormous pools of money out of the promises of thousands of merchants scattered across the continent, and then aim all of that capital, like a fire hose, at the King of Spain. What made them almost impossible to replace was that they controlled this whole web. If the crown leaned too hard on any one group of lenders, the Genoese could simply draw on another market, in another city, and keep the money flowing on their terms. They had made themselves the indispensable plumbing of European finance, and the King of Spain was their single largest customer. By mastering this paper machine, a few dozen families in one small Italian republic came to hold the purse strings of the largest empire on earth, and they pulled off a trick that was, in essence, an early version of a modern currency swap. The crown would sell them silver on the spot in Spain, and in return, the Genoese would deliver gold to Antwerp to pay the soldiers in Flanders. The bankers moved the money, managed the exchange rates, took the risk, and skimmed a rich percentage off the top of every single transaction. Some estimates put their cut on moving the money at around 10%, on operation after operation, year after year. They had turned the crown's basic inability to move its own money into one of the most profitable businesses in Europe. And they became so deeply woven into the Spanish war machine that the line between banker and government simply dissolved. The most vivid example is a Genoese banker named Ambrogio Spinola. He did not merely lend the crown money to fight the war in the Netherlands. He personally financed campaigns out of his own family's immense fortune, and then he went further still. He took command of the army of Flanders as its general and led it in the field, winning famous sieges. Let that sink in. The man paying for the war was also the man running the war. A private banker from Genoa was commanding the armies of the King of Spain, funded substantially by his own money, which the crown then owed back to him. The empire's wars had become, in a very real sense, a business venture operated by its financiers. So you had this system humming along, the silver flowing in, the bankers lending against it, the wars consuming everything, and it produced a result that seems, on its face, absurd. The King of Spain kept going broke. Philip II, the son of Charles V, was the most powerful monarch of his age, master of an empire that spanned the globe, commander of the greatest military forces in Europe, and he declared bankruptcy 4 separate times, in 1557, in 1560, in 1575, and again in 1596, and his successors kept the tradition going right through the next century, defaulting again and again, until across the whole Habsburg era, Spain had suspended its debt payments more than a dozen times. To this day, economists studying the history of sovereign debt often name Spain as the greatest serial defaulter of all time. But here is where you have to be careful, because the word bankruptcy makes you picture the wrong thing. When the King of Spain declared bankruptcy, he did not vanish in a puff of smoke, and he did not simply refuse to ever pay anyone anything. What happened was more subtle and more interesting. It was called a suspension of payments. The crown would stop servicing its short-term loans, the asientos, the high interest debt owed to the bankers, and then it would force a renegotiation. In these settlements, the expensive short-term debt would be converted into cheaper, long-term government bonds called juros. So the king wasn't erasing the debt. He was strong-arming his lenders into swapping their high-interest, fast repayment loans for lower-interest bonds that would be paid off slowly over many years. The most spectacular of these was the bankruptcy of 1575, which involved a sum of around 14.5 million ducats, roughly 2 years of the entire crown's revenue, and it was so severe that it froze the whole credit market inside Castile, dragging down Spanish merchants and businesses who had nothing to do with the king's foreign wars. And this is where the abstract machinery of default turns into something horrifying, because that 1575 bankruptcy did not just move numbers around on a ledger, it got thousands of people killed. Here is how. When the king suspended payments, the whole delicate money transfer machine seized up. The bankers, furious and unpaid, refused to keep performing the transfers the crown needed until they had a new settlement. And that meant the money stopped reaching the one place it absolutely had to reach: the Army of Flanders. The Spanish soldiers fighting the endless war in the Netherlands had already gone months, and in some cases years, without their wages. Some units were owed close to 4 years of back pay. And now, with the crown bankrupt and the bankers on strike, there was no money coming at all. So the army did what unpaid armies have always done. It mutinied. And in November of 1576, thousands of those mutinous, unpaid Spanish soldiers descended on Antwerp, the richest and most important commercial city in the Low Countries, and they tore it apart. For 3 days, they looted, burned, and murdered. They gutted the merchant houses, burned the account books, destroyed the exchange, and killed civilians in the streets in numbers that estimates put anywhere from 7,000 to well over 15,000 people. Over 1,000 buildings went up in flames. It became known as the Spanish Fury, and it remains the worst massacre in the history of the Low Countries. And its root cause was not some grand strategy or religious hatred. Its root cause was a bankruptcy in Madrid, a broken payment, and a banker who wouldn't move the money. The timing trap, the gap between annual silver and daily war, had just been paid for in blood by the people of a city that had nothing to do with any of it. And in a final irony, the destruction of Antwerp helped drive Europe's financial center north to a rising Dutch port called Amsterdam. So on the surface, this looks like a story of a reckless king repeatedly stiffing his poor, long-suffering bankers. And for a long time, that is exactly how historians told it. One of the most famous, Fernand Braudel, argued that only the strange indulgence of essentially irrational bankers, lenders who kept handing money to a monarch who kept defaulting, allowed Spain to run up such impossible debts. In this telling, the bankers were the victims, the fools who kept getting burned by a deadbeat king. But here is the twist, and it changes everything. Because when modern economic historians went back and dug into the actual account books, the surviving ledgers of these banking families, they found that the bankers were not fools at all. They were not being burned. In fact, one detailed study of the loans to Philip II gave him a memorable nickname. It called him the borrower from hell, a serial defaulter, the worst credit risk imaginable. And yet the same study concluded that lending to this borrower from hell was a genuinely good business. Across the entire cycle of lending and default, taken as a whole, the bankers made excellent money. Superb returns, because a Spanish default was never really a total loss for them. Remember, the loans were collateralized. The bankers held those long-term bonds, the juros, as security. They held silver export licenses. They held claims on tax revenues, on mines, on monopolies. So when the king suspended payments and forced a renegotiation, the bankers didn't walk away empty-handed. They walked away holding pieces of the Spanish state that would keep paying them steadily for decades, and the interest rates they charged in the good years, those brutal rates above 15%, were high precisely because they had priced the defaults in. They knew the king would eventually stop paying. They built that expectation into the cost of every loan, and they still came out ahead. They also spread their risk cleverly, breaking loans into shares and parceling them out among many investors, so that no single default could sink any one of them. So look at what had actually been constructed here. The bankers had built a machine that won whether the king paid or not. If the crown paid, they collected their enormous interest. And if the crown defaulted, they kept the collateral, the bonds, the silver, the revenues, the mines, and simply rolled the whole thing into a new arrangement that kept the money flowing to them. Heads, the bankers win. Tails, the bankers still win. They just win more slowly. The King of Spain thought that by declaring bankruptcy, he was beating his lenders, escaping his debts. In reality, he was walking deeper into a trap that had been designed from the very beginning so that the men holding the collateral could never really lose. And this brings us to the cruelest irony of the whole story. What did Spain actually get for all of it? For the mountain of silver, for the global empire, for a century and a half of war? Astonishingly little that lasted, because the silver never really stayed in Spain. It arrived in Seville, and it flowed straight back out again, almost without stopping, into the hands of the Genoese and the Fuggers, out to pay foreign armies, out to buy foreign goods that Spain no longer made for itself. The treasure passed through the country like water through a sieve, and on its way through it did real damage. That flood of silver caused what economists call the price revolution, a long, grinding rise in prices across all of Europe. And that inflation hit Spain especially hard, making Spanish goods too expensive to compete, quietly strangling Spanish industry, while the manufacturers of the Netherlands and Italy and elsewhere grew rich selling to the silver-soaked Spanish market. So the silver enriched almost everyone except Spain. Spain got the glory, and the wars, and the debt. Its rivals got the actual wealth, and the debt was monstrous. In the 1530s, the crown's long-term debt stood at somewhere around 1 million ducats. By the end of the century, by 1598, it had exploded past 85 million. The state had become, in a very real sense, rich only in claims against itself, an empire that produced more treasure than anyone in history, and yet owed all of it, and more, to a small circle of private financiers. By the 17th century, the whole structure was buckling. Spain was exhausted, its silver output beginning to decline, its wars unwinnable, its power visibly draining away, default following default. Each new king inherited the same trap, borrowed against the same shrinking silver, and suspended payments all over again. The defaults kept coming in 1607, in 1627, in 1647, and beyond. And as the Genoese themselves grew wary of a crown that could no longer be relied on, the king's chief minister looked for fresh lenders and increasingly turned to a new group. Portuguese bankers, many of them from converso families, brought in to keep the credit flowing when the old sources ran dry. The identity of the bankers kept changing. The trap never did, and the bankers of Genoa, whose fortunes had become so tightly bound to Spain's over that long century, were dragged down with it in the end. Their golden age faded as their great client declined, and a place that had quietly financed the world found its own wealth ebbing away. But by then, it hardly mattered, because the machine they had built, the whole apparatus of bills of exchange, of public debt, of moving money across borders and lending against future revenue, had already outgrown them. Those techniques, refined over generations in the service of the Spanish crown, would migrate north to Amsterdam and then to London, where they would become the foundation of modern finance itself, and the engine of empires far more durable than Spain's. So let me leave you with the heart of it. Spain believed, when it found that mountain of silver, that it had discovered infinite wealth, a treasure so vast that its power would be unshakable forever. What it had actually discovered was something else. It had discovered how to borrow against the future so completely, so relentlessly, that the future was never really its own to begin with. The silver was pledged before it was mined. It was mortgaged before it sailed. It was spent before it landed. And it was owed before it was ever counted. The kings signed the contracts and wore the crown, and called themselves masters of the world. But the men who mattered were the ones holding the collateral, in Genoa and in Augsburg, the ones who had lent Spain its own silver back, and quietly taken the mines, the mercury, the revenues, and the provinces as their interest. Because in the end, you do not need to wear the crown to own the empire. You just need to hold everything the crown has already promised away. If this pulled back a curtain for you, do me a favor and hit that like button, and subscribe, because it helps us keep digging into the hidden financial machinery that decided the fate of nations. And if you want to see what happened next, how a small Dutch republic and then a single bank in London took this exact machine, perfected it, and used it to build an empire that would eclipse Spain entirely. Go watch our video on how modern finance was born in Amsterdam and conquered the world from London. The Silver Empire fell. The machine that bled it never did. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.